80% of the silver that comes out of the ground every year disappears into industrial applications that almost no retail precious metals holder ever thinks about, and the tracking mechanisms that would allow the market to see this consumption clearly, to account for it precisely, to factor it into price discovery with the rigor that supply-demand dynamics demand. Those mechanisms either do not exist or exist in forms so fragmented and opaque that the true picture of silver's industrial necessity remains fundamentally invisible to the investors making decisions about their holdings. This invisibility is not accidental, it is structural, and understanding what hides inside it may be the single most important variable in determining whether you hold your silver through what comes next, or whether you become one of the people who, years from now, will regret the moment they did not understand what they owned. Let me be precise about where we begin. The United States Geological Survey publishes annual data on silver production and consumption. The data exists. It is public. It is, by the standards of government reporting, reasonably thorough. And if you take the time to read it carefully, filter out the noise, cross-reference it against industry reports from solar manufacturers and semiconductor producers and electronics companies, you begin to see something that the mainstream financial commentary about silver almost never mentions. The silver market is not primarily a monetary market. It is not primarily a speculative market. It is a consumption market. A market where supply and demand are determined not by investment flows or central bank positioning, but by the material requirements of industrial processes that the modern world has made structurally dependent on silver in ways that have no historical precedent. Consider what happened in the past 18 months. Silver rose from roughly $25 an ounce to $115, a move of more than 360%. And yet, in all the mainstream financial coverage of that move, in all the commentary about investment flows and technical breakouts and momentum trading, you will find almost no discussion of the single most important variable underlying that price discovery. Industrial consumption is accelerating. Not declining, not plateauing, accelerating, and the supply mechanisms that historically kept pace with incremental demand increases are hitting hard structural limits that nobody in the financial mainstream seems willing to discuss with the seriousness the moment demands. Let me introduce you to a concept that every serious silver holder needs to carry with them. It is called the silver deficit. It is not a theoretical construct. It is not the fevered arithmetic of someone trying to sell you coins. It is a measured, documented, year-over-year reality that has been persistent and widening for 6 consecutive years. In each of those years, global silver consumption from industrial applications, from photography, from solar panel manufacturing, from electronics and electrical applications, from medical devices, from mirrors and reflective coatings, has exceeded the amount of new silver brought to market through mining. The difference, the gap between what the world consumed and what it produced, had to come from somewhere. It came from above-ground stocks, from reserves, from the accumulated silver sitting in warehouses and vaults and industrial stockpiles around the world. And with each passing year, those reserves are getting smaller. Now here is where most retail investors disconnect from the analysis. They think about silver in monetary terms. They think about it in investment terms. They think about central banks and geopolitical de-dollarization and monetary resets. And all of that is relevant. All of that matters. But it matters secondarily. It matters downstream. What matters first, what matters upstream, is this fundamental reality. The world needs more silver than the world is producing. And that gap is widening, not narrowing. And the industrial customers who depend on that silver, the solar manufacturers, the semiconductor producers, the electronics companies, they cannot wait for some distant monetary revaluation to make silver economically viable to mine in greater quantities. They need the silver now. They need it to power the energy transition. They need it to manufacture the devices that the global economy has become dependent on. And as their demand accelerates into a supply picture that is fundamentally constrained, the math of scarcity begins to assert itself in ways that even the most skeptical analyst is finding harder to dismiss. Let me walk you through the mechanics of how this works in practice. When you install a solar panel on your roof, that panel contains roughly 15 to 20 grams of silver. That silver is there because solar cells require silver to function. The conductivity, the electrical properties, the ability to convert sunlight into usable electricity without catastrophic losses, all of it depends on the precise properties of silver. There is no adequate substitute. Copper does not work. Aluminum does not work. The engineers have spent decades trying to find alternatives. The physics does not allow it. And so every solar panel that goes into the grid consumes silver. And here is the structural reality that separates this industrial demand from every previous application. When the solar panel reaches the end of its useful life in 25 or 30 years, the silver in that panel does not return to the market for recycling. It sits in landfills. It is trapped in recycled module material, where the extraction cost is prohibitive compared to the value of the recovered silver. It is functionally removed from the monetary supply forever. The same dynamic applies to electric vehicles. An EV contains roughly 50 to 100 grams of silver in its electrical contacts, its relays, its high-current switching applications. That silver is there because the efficiency requirements of an electric motor powered by a battery that costs $5,000 to $8,000 demand materials that can handle current without losses. Silver is the optimal choice. And when that EV reaches the end of its useful life, when it goes to a recycling facility for battery recovery and material processing, the silver follows the same trajectory it follows in solar panels. The extraction cost, the environmental burden of recovering silver from complex mixed metal streams, is not justified by the silver value. And so that silver too effectively disappears from the monetary supply. And then there is semiconductors. I want you to sit with this number. The semiconductor industry consumed more than 100 million troy ounces of silver in 2024. 100 million ounces. That is roughly 30% of all new silver production globally. And semiconductor consumption is not level. It is not declining. It is growing at roughly 8 to 12% annually, driven by artificial intelligence, data center expansion, automotive semiconductor content that has roughly tripled in the past decade. Every new chip design drives silver content per unit up, not down. The industry is moving toward more capable processors with higher current densities that require more sophisticated electrical contact materials, which means more silver. Now, combine these three industrial consumption streams, solar, automotive, semiconductors, and you are looking at industrial applications that will consume roughly 70 to 80% of all newly mined silver for the foreseeable future. That is not an estimate. That is the analyzed output of the industry-specific demand forecasts. And here is where the conversation becomes genuinely urgent for anyone holding silver. The mining industry has not accelerated primary silver production in response to this demand increase. Why? Because primary silver is not profitable to mine in isolation. Silver is a byproduct. It comes out of copper mines and zinc mines and lead mines. Those mines are constrained by geology, by permitting, by capital requirements, by the time it takes to bring a new mine into production, all of which operate on timescales of 5 to 10 years. A mining company cannot decide in 2026 to produce more copper-dependent byproduct silver in time to meet 2027 demand. The lag between demand acceleration and supply response is measured in years, not months, years. And this is the point where the structural deficit becomes the binding constraint, because as industrial consumption continues to accelerate, as solar installation rates continue to compound, as EV production continues to ramp, as semiconductor consumption continues to grow, the above-ground stocks that have been quietly drawn down for 6 consecutive years are being depleted at a pace that cannot be sustained indefinitely. The industrial customers are not speculative. They are not going to reduce demand because the price moved up. They are going to reduce demand only when the price becomes so high that substitution becomes economically viable, or when the application itself becomes economically non-viable. And neither of those conditions is in play at current silver prices. So consumption will continue, mining will remain constrained, and the deficit will widen. Let me introduce you to a man whose name I will keep private. He works for a major solar panel manufacturer. He has worked in the industry for 16 years and has watched the evolution of silver consumption in photovoltaic cells across multiple decades. About 3 years ago, he started noticing something that his engineering instinct recognized as structural rather than cyclical. The industry's silver consumption was accelerating faster than the supply models he had access to predicted. The recycling rates for old modules were not improving. The efficiency gains from R&D were not translating into meaningful silver content reductions. And the pipeline of new installations globally was pointing toward consumption that would require mining output to increase by roughly 25% from current levels to be sustainably supplied. That did not seem to be happening. So he started asking questions. He looked at the supply side. He looked at the mining data. And he came to a conclusion that someone with genuine technical expertise could only reach if they were willing to see what the data actually showed. The solar industry was moving into a structural silver supply constraint. Not eventually, not in some distant future when environmental concerns might finally force recycling improvements. Now, in 2026, and the price discovery mechanism in the silver market did not reflect this reality. He started buying silver. Quietly. Consistently. He did not announce it. He did not explain it. He just began the process of positioning for what his technical analysis suggested was coming. And what he knew with the certainty of an engineer who understands the material requirements of the systems he builds is that silver consumption will not slow down because mining cannot keep pace. The consumption will continue, and the price will find the level where industrial customers begin to make hard choices about whether the applications themselves remain economically viable. We are not there yet, but we are moving in that direction with a speed that should concern anyone serious about the relationship between supply and price. Here is what I want you to understand about the tracking problem I opened with. The data on industrial consumption exists in fragmented form. A solar manufacturer knows its silver consumption. A semiconductor company knows its silver consumption. The mining companies know what they produce. The U.S. Geological Survey aggregates some of this into annual reports. But there is no centralized, real-time, transparent mechanism by which the market can see the full picture of industrial demand against mining supply and adjust prices instantaneously to reflect that reality. And so the price discovery happens in slow motion. It happens through the gradual recognition that the deficit is real and persistent and widening. And the investors who understand this dynamic are the ones who position before the recognition becomes obvious to everyone. The ones who understand that silver's industrial necessity is not a secondary variable in a primarily monetary story. It is the primary variable. The monetary story is downstream from this. The monetary revaluation is what happens when scarcity finally becomes unavoidable. And here is the part that should focus your attention acutely. The solar installation rate is not slowing, it is accelerating. Global solar capacity additions are expected to grow another 30% by 2028. That means another 200 billion modules are going into the grid, each one consuming 15 to 20 grams of silver, and not returning it. EV production is not slowing, it is accelerating. Global EV sales are expected to reach 40 million units annually by 2030. That is 2 million units every single month consuming silver that does not come back. Semiconductor consumption is not slowing, it is accelerating. The artificial intelligence data center build-out alone is expected to require roughly 40% more semiconductor production than current levels over the next 4 years. All of this is structural. All of it is driven by technological progress and energy transition imperatives that nobody is going to reverse. And all of it is drawing down the available silver at a pace that cannot be sustained indefinitely without a price adjustment so substantial that it fundamentally changes the economics of mining and extraction and recycling. Now, I want to address the objection that is already forming in your mind. If industrial demand is this acute, why hasn't the price reflected it? The answer is that it is reflecting it. Silver moved from $25 to $115 in less than 2 years. That move is the market recognizing something. What the market has not yet priced in is the full recognition of what that demand picture means for silver's future scarcity. Price discovery in commodity markets happens in waves. First, the alert participants recognize the structural change. Then they accumulate. Then the price moves. Then the analysis becomes undeniable. Then the broader market follows. And then reality has to catch up with the new price in ways that either validate it or reject it. We are somewhere in that wave. Not at the beginning, not at the end. Somewhere in the middle. And the people who understand the industrial consumption story, not the monetary story, not the speculation story, the actual consumption story, those people are positioned for what the wave moves toward. Here's what I want you to do with this understanding. First, recognize that when you hold silver, you are not holding a speculation on monetary revaluation alone. You are holding a position in a commodity with structural demand that mining cannot sustainably supply at current prices. Second, understand that the industrial customers, the solar manufacturers, the semiconductor companies, the EV producers, are the real demand backstop. They will consume silver at prices that would seem economically insane for speculation. They will consume it because they have no choice. And that floor underneath silver's price is being built higher every single year. Third, if you are considering adding to a silver position, recognize that the window to do so at prices that do not fully reflect this industrial necessity is genuinely finite. Not because of monetary policy or central bank action or some distant revaluation. Because the structural deficit is real right now, and the supply mechanisms that could theoretically address it operate on timescales that do not compress. The silver market is not primarily about investment thesis anymore. It is about industrial reality. And industrial reality is moving toward a collision point where demand that cannot be deferred meets supply that cannot be expanded quickly enough to meet it. When that collision happens, the price does not adjust gradually. It adjusts with the speed that real scarcity enforces. And the people who understood the mechanics of industrial consumption, who saw the supply constraints clearly, who recognized that this was not a speculative market temporarily disconnected from fundamentals, but a consumption market moving steadily toward its binding constraint. Those people will not be surprised by what follows. They will be prepared. Now go back to the data. Look at the solar installation rates. Look at the EV production ramps. Look at the semiconductor demand projections. Look at the primary silver mining capacity. Do your own arithmetic. The math does not hide. It is just invisible if you are not looking at it. And that invisibility is what you have now. How long that invisibility lasts is a question that the industrial consumption story, not the monetary story, is already beginning to answer.